Okay, my name is Steve Menham. I'm the president of the Mystic River Historical Society. Thank you for coming out tonight. Before Lindsay introduces our speaker tonight, I just want to pass along a few notes. Like last month's meeting, we are actually recording this thanks to SEC TV, and it'll be shown on channel 12. And for our members, there'll actually be a YouTube link. Well, for anybody, there'll be a YouTube link, but we'll be letting our members know about that for those who missed tonight or who want to see it again. I just want to take a minute to go through some of the upcoming presentations that we have. Excuse me. In April, Jim Streeter on April 27th will be presenting the Mystic River Bridge Past and Present. I think everyone knows that the bridge downtown is celebrating its 100th year this July. And Jim will be talking about not only the current bridge, but the history of the bridges before that. And we'll also be calling that meeting our annual meeting. Normally we do it in May, but we're going to be having a walking tour of Elm Grove Cemetery that Marilyn Comrie will be conducting. That'll be limited probably to maybe only 40 people or so. So to maximize the number of members that would be coming to a meeting, we'll do it in April. And because of that, and we expect a lot of people at Jim's talk, we'll have the cookies at 7 o'clock, but we'll start our meeting at 7:15 just to do some business, re-elect some board members, review what we've done this past year, what we do as a standard thing for our annual meeting, and then at 7:30 we'll have Jim proceed with the talk. And as I mentioned, in May, specifically on May 21st, Marilyn will be doing a walking tour of Elm Grove Cemetery, Mystic's Garden Cemetery. And I'll also make one pitch, and I've been saying this at all of our meetings, but if you're really interested in volunteering for the Society, we could certainly use your help. I'll be canvassing our members for interest in joining some of the committees we have, but we do also need some board members. So if anyone is interested in that, you can let me know. You can email us. You can call our number on the website, and we have membership applications in the back. So we're always looking to enhance our ranks. It'd be great to have you. And with that, Lindsay. Yes, Marilyn.
I just wanted to remind everybody that the Historical Society is partnering with the Mystic Chamber of Commerce for the bridge celebration, and as part of that, we're opening an exhibit at the Groton Public Library all about the bridge and the history of the bridge. And we're having an opening reception for that a week from Saturday, April 2nd from 2 to 4 at the library. We hope you'll come. If you can't, we hope you'll stop in and see the exhibit. It'll be up until the end of October, and it's free and open during regular library hours. So thank you.
Thank you for reminding me. I should have mentioned that. Lindsay.
Hi, good evening. So Matt Novosad is originally from Franklin, Connecticut, but we're also very lucky that he has spent time living and working here in Mystic. He's currently a master's student in history at the University of Connecticut, where he has previously received a degree in maritime studies with a concentration in anthropology. He has worked at Mystic Seaport Museum and is an alumnus of the Williams Mystic Coastal and Ocean Studies program. Which is how I know him and know that he is a good guy. Most recently, Matt has published an article on American World War I submarines in Salient Points magazine. I just found out he's been a commentator on some podcasts recently, and he is also the president of the Franklin, Connecticut Historical Society. Please welcome Matt Novosad.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. It looks like a very lovely crowd. So I'm sure the burning question this evening for most of you is, where exactly is Franklin and what does it have to do with the sea? This is a question I sometimes ask myself. And instead of just presenting a lot of really interesting people and a lot of interesting stories on their own in kind of an unconnected fashion, I figured I would present this talk in a way that showcases some of my research processes and some of the ways that I'm hoping to change the way that history gets talked about in my local community. And so And the second part of this is local history and narrative, and the stories that we tell ourselves about our past. So before I get into where exactly Franklin is and what it is, I realized on my way up that I didn't have this slide, and most people would not be familiar with some of the place names I'd be throwing around. So many of you may be familiar with Norwich. It was originally settled by Europeans in 1659. And what's now Franklin was part of that original 9-mile square, and it was settled originally about 1680 by some of the proprietors of Norwich at the time. In 1716, with the town of Norwich, and then in 1718 with the colony of Connecticut, the Second Society of Norwich, known as West Farms, was formed. This formed the basis for what would become Franklin. In the 1760s, the Eighth Society of Norwich split off from West Farms, and I'll point it out on a map, in 1761, but within about 2 decades, they reformed together into the town of Franklin in 1786. I'll probably be throwing around West Farms and Franklin pretty interchangeably this evening, which is why I wanted to make sure I pointed this out so it doesn't get too confusing. And Franklin is composed mainly of hills. There's currently no river access, and it's incredibly rural. And so kind of town history has often felt like it's this idyllic, small rural town that hasn't really changed much since the 1600s. And again, some of the things that I'm about to tell you, you would probably not expect a small farming town to have this sort of history. So this is a current map of Franklin. So down here is where Norwich is. This is, if you've ever been to Dodd Stadium to go watch baseball games, that's right there. And so this is the current border of Franklin, as it's sat since 1861. Outside of our borders lies the Shetucket River, which ends up feeding into the Thames and then down into the Long Island Sound. The meeting house and where I live is approximately right here. Our local museum is right off of 32. And again, most of this is all hills, interspersed with some flat farmland. Now, until 1861, however, Franklin actually had river access. And this is kind of a big deal because in the 1850s, this region of the Shetucket River was decided to have been a good spot for a textile mill. And so in 1857, what's now Sprague, Connecticut, a textile mill was opened. And the workers actually all lived on the Franklin side of the river. And this actually became the village of Baltic. And the mill and the overseers were on the Lisbon side of the Shetucket River. This was not the most opportune arrangement for running a mill, kind of essentially out of 2 towns. So in 1861, this was chopped off into what's now Sprague, Connecticut. So that was where Sprague came from. And so it was then that we actually lost any and all real access to waterways. There's a couple of small brooks that run through town, but these days there isn't. And then if we zoom out even further, a little bit back, this is the original 9-mile square of Norwich, and that's Norwich today. And so you can see this is where Franklin is. And then, of course, just zooming out even more, for those who aren't necessarily familiar, go all the way up here. There's Franklin, down the Thames River. So a lot of town history in Franklin has been told through the lens of the Congregational Church. And this isn't a bad thing. The church has formed a pretty integral part of Franklin's community since its inception, especially since it was opened, the church was opened in the first in the 1710s. And this is the current church. This photograph is actually from 1907 on Meeting House Hill. And as I said, this wasn't a bad thing. A lot of the history has been told through the perspective of the church and a lot of church documents. But what it does mean is that the history tends to be a little bit limited in that there are things that aren't said in those documents. People who weren't church members, for instance. And so while, again, very useful resource, very useful perspective to have on the town, it's not the only one. And so since I became president of the Historical Society, one of the things I've discovered is that there are so many other perspectives in addition to this. And so those who often have been forgotten in a traditional telling of Franklin's history include people who weren't members of the church, African Americans, Indigenous Americans, a lot of European immigrants, especially in the late 1800s into the 1900s, people who were transient, who were only here were only in Franklin, I should say, for a few years. Some who left before Franklin was incorporated as a town in 1786, because those records often get wrapped up in Norwich's records rather than the church records. People who were often working in lower class. and also those who didn't establish long-lasting roots in town. So some of these categories do have overlap. So for example, people who left before Franklin was incorporated often didn't establish long-lasting roots, but some of these might be families that left in the late 1800s. And there's, again, a lot of these other categories, there's a lot of overlap. So for example, this picture on the right here is of the 29th Connecticut Regiment during the Civil War. The 29th was an African-American regiment, and there were a lot of men from Franklin who actually joined this unit. However, they weren't in Franklin in 1860 when the census was taken that year, and they weren't in Franklin in 1870 when that census was taken. And the only reason we know that they were ever in Franklin was because they joined the 29th, and that's where they listed their residences if they'd been. They were most likely, farm hands who came and lived on local farms in Franklin and worked on them. Another similar story right here this is Julius Fleischmann. Julius Fleischmann was a Viennese Jew who was born in Austria, and in 1938, about a month after the Anschluss, when Germany took over Austria, when the Nazis took over Austria, he was deported first to Dachau concentration camp and then Buchenwald. In 1939, approximately a month and a half before Germany invaded Poland, he was released, from the best that I can tell from what documents we have, that he agreed to emigrate out of the country. And so he immigrated to Connecticut with his wife and his son, and they ended up setting up a poultry farm in Connecticut. But again, they were only here for about 15 years. He moved to another part of Connecticut after that. So it was a fairly short time in town. He didn't establish a lot of long-lasting roots. Although there are actually still people in town, and I mentioned some of his story, and they're like, wow, I actually remember them, and I didn't know that about them. So some of those roots aren't necessarily visible, and sometimes they aren't. So to start bringing this towards the maritime stuff. How would it change the narrative? Varnum's Folly, William Varnum, and his mysterious life. So in town, there's been this gentleman that we've known about for a long time named William Varnum, because he built these two towers which still stand. Now in Connecticut, you farm a lot of rocks, and so my personal pet theory has always been, well, he needed something to do with all the rocks he farmed, right? What else are you going to do with them other than build a stone wall? So he built these two nice little towers, and you can still go up to see them. They're on private property, but we've worked out some stuff with them to do walks. And this was taken up at the same time as the church photograph as well. But we could never figure out a lot about his life. This is what we knew. He married a woman from Franklin named Mary Ann Brewster. He was missing from any and all censuses until 1870. We knew where he owned his farm, and that he built his two stone towers, and then he died in Franklin in 1879. But there were all of these stories and a lot of conjecture about him and about the towers, which kind of drove this mystery. So some of the stories included that he'd been a sea captain during the Civil War, that he was insane or just kind of crazy, that he'd been a sailor in the Navy, or that he was severely addicted to alcohol. That contributed to some of these other things and why he built towers. But again, this is all conjecture, and we never had any proof for it, and we only knew this. And so that's not a whole lot to go on for something as interesting as two stone monuments that just kind of, hang out in town. So before I talked explicitly about this breakthrough and figuring out what his life was like, what happened was last year, my mother and I went to the Norwich Library, the Otis Library, to look at records for the Norwich Bulletin and other Norwich papers, as they're not really digitized before the First World War. And so we were looking specifically actually for his wife's obituary. We knew when she died, and it was within a time frame for some of the microfilm that they had, so we went and looked for it. And this obituary actually mentions that William, who had died many years before she, had been a sailor out of New London. And it took me probably a solid half a day, 12 hours, sitting at home, the light bulb goes off, and I'm like, wait a second, what if he was a whaler out of New London because he was a sailor? That would explain potentially some of this stuff. Well, so then I go online, because there are some really wonderful online databases to do this kind of research with. So I went first to the New Bedford Whaling Museum's Whaling Crew Lists database. Typed in William Varnum, lo and behold, there's our mystery man. And he shows up on a couple different voyages here. And he lists his residence as Franklin's, Connecticut. And we learned a little bit about his height. So after he moved to Franklin, as it turns out, there are 3 confirmed whaling voyages I can place him on. And this was a huge breakthrough because all of a sudden, wow, here's all this new information about this person that we had no idea existed beforehand. So the first of his 3 voyages since he moved to Franklin the first one was in 1847, almost immediately after he got married. He went on the Indian Chief. It was built in Portsmouth, Virginia. It was ship-rigged. It was owned by Frank Chewin Company out of New London. And that voyage lasted until 1851. Well, okay, that's why he wasn't on the 1850 census, because he was out at sea somewhere in the Pacific, right? And the Mystic Seaport actually has one of the logbooks for this voyage, specifically the period from January 7th, 1850 until February 14th, 1851, the day before it pulled back into New London. The second one, the North American. Not too long after he got home from the first voyage, he ends up going out again. This one was a little bit more tricky to find because it turns out his name was misspelled. And it was spelled Varney. But again, there was a second one. And there's a third one which is a little bit trickier because I think he ended up leaving the North America at some point and came back to Connecticut and then got on this voyage on the New England in 1854 as the North America was out it was still out whaling until 1855. So I'm not entirely sure what had happened there, but somehow he ends up back in Connecticut by 1854. And so this was the last confirmed voyage I know of his after he moved to Franklin. And so, well, what did we learn from all these databases then? Well, we learned a lot about him. We learned his approximate date of birth, somewhere around 1815. I knew that he was actually born in Massachusetts, in Essex. Then he was actually pretty short, about 5'2", which makes these towers all the more impressive considering his height. That, he had been a whaler that had at least 3 voyages after he got married. And that, the voyage of the Indian Chief is why he wasn't on that census. And that he was likely a career whaler, and he may have been on voyages as early as 1831. I'm doing some more research. There's an individual whose name keeps getting spelled Varney from 1831 on that actually matches his description both in height and in where he was born. So I'm fairly certain that's him, but the name is spelled just a little bit differently. So that breakthrough ends up leading to more all of a sudden. Well, this is an example of a list I've been putting together of merchant mariners and whalers from Franklin. And so far I've been able to identify 57 from the 18th and 19th centuries, and these individuals are really limited to about 3 decades. You have from about 1800 to about 1810, and then from about 1830 until for about 4 decades, about 1830 to 1860. And so it's actually a relatively short amount of time to have, for such a small town, to find 57 different sailors. Franklin's population has varied over the years. These days the population is about 1,900, give or take. The height of the population right before the creation of Sprague in 1860 was about 2,300. But before and after those dates, it was usually anywhere between like 600 and 1,000 people. So again, in these periods where you might have only 600 people in town, to have a pretty significant little chunk of the town to be off at sea, and again, only for those years and for what sources have survived. And the amazing thing about this breakthrough and these lists, I've also been using work done by the Mystic Seaport. They have a lot of sailors' databases as well for New London. And this list includes a lot of people who weren't members of the church, or African American, who may have been in town for only a little bit of time, people who didn't establish long-lasting roots. And also, there were often lower and working class families that weren't captured in a lot of the traditional sources that were used for town history. And again, I want to stress that the traditional sources used for town history are very valuable and very useful, but this helps add to the story. So some interesting names on here. For instance, there's the Hyde. Number of the Hyde family went off to sea when they were young at various points in time. Not in this screenshot is a man named Ricardo Rudd, who was born in the 1780s. He went to sea in about 1805, and his family never heard from him again. I ended up finding a record of him in the South Carolina militia during the War of 1812. So it seems after he went to sea for a little bit, he ended up in South Carolina. Not much past that. And that's a kind of another example of an individual who didn't have long-lasting roots. The Rudd family was in Franklin for a long time, but Ricardo wasn't. And his family, he never really got picked up in any other sources as a result. So this kind of work has done a lot to showcase this huge other side of Franklin history and of local small town history. And just by asking questions of, what isn't shown on the sources that we currently use a lot of. And again, like I said, these are kinds of people that aren't often on the church records. It's because some of these people too aren't, congregationalist. And I go back, William Fleischmann, or Julius Fleischmann, he's Jewish. He's not going to be going to the congregational church, right? So again, these sorts of sources are really, really useful. And of course, it turns out we even had a whaling captain in Franklin. Again, if you remember the map that I showed you, Franklin's not really close to the Long Island Sound, but we had a whaling captain move to Franklin in the 1850s. His name was George May, and this is an image of his son when his son was much older. George had been the master of the ship called the Dromo, and he was on its 1856 to 1860 voyage, and the Mystic Seaport again holds one of its logbooks for that voyage, which is extra cool. And Charles was but 14 years of age, and he followed his father to sea on that voyage. And so they actually ended up going out to the Pacific. They stopped in Hawaii for a while and ended up going up to the Arctic. And ends up coming back. Charles goes to sea during the Civil War again, and I have to do a lot more research on this claim, but he was reportedly aboard a whale ship that, while starting its voyage, it was down in the Caribbean area, and it was attacked by the Confederate raider Alabama during the Civil War, and that's kind of why he ended up stopped going to sea after that whole little adventure. And the Mays aren't someone that actually have been captured by church sources because they were Baptist, not Congregationalist. And the Mays actually lived in town for a significant amount of time. George ended up farming for the rest of his life most of his life before he ends up moving out to Oregon. And Charles moves to Norwich, fairly close by. And he went into business and other things like that. But there they were, whaling captain in Franklin. And so again, these whaling and sailors protection paper databases have been a really, really important resource that helped us recover this almost lost part of Franklin's history. And it helped us again to place whaling in the ocean as a central part of our history in a way that would have been unimaginable even 5 or 10 years ago. Partly because that's when a lot of these resources have since been digitized. And this digitization and these online resources have been really, really crucial in doing this kind of research. And so, of course, the reason I can bet probably everyone is here is for pirates. As the title said, I didn't want to front load the pirates because it's the most exciting part, if you ask me. Because in addition to whalers and merchants, we also had a little bit of a run-in with pirates for a while. Well, one person, I should say. And he ties back to Millard Fillmore. And you may be asking, what the heck does Millard Fillmore have to do with pirates? Well, and also with Franklin, I should add. So this is just an image of a pirate supposedly being executed in Providence, Rhode Island. I thought it was fitting for this slide. And so what Millard Fillmore has to do with all of this is that reportedly when he was in office as president, he owned his great-grandfather's sword, which had quite the story attached to it. So in Ipswich, Massachusetts in 1702, there was a man named John Fillmore who was born. His father was a sailor who was captured a merchant sailor who was captured by the French during Queen Anne's War and died of disease as he was being repatriated back in 1711. So John grew up, he was about 11 years old at the time. And so, his mother was widowed. And he ends up becoming a carpenter's apprentice. His older brothers actually had a pretty infamous encounter, at least in the era, encounter at sea with some indigenous Americans where there was involved some fighting and killing in 1722. And amidst this pretty mixed family history with sailing and going to sea and getting the fights and things like that, young John Fillmore had really only one desire in his life, and that was to go to sea. And I can kind of get that. Granted, for a long time, I never wanted to go near boats, and then I got into undergrad, and I found boats really interesting, and I started going on them a lot more. So I totally get the desire. And so his mother really didn't want him going to sea because, his father died at sea, his brothers almost died at sea, so why would she send young John? But finally he turns 21, and in 1723 she says, okay, fine, you can go with your uncle on his fishing schooner out of Gloucester. It was Mark Haskell on a ship named the Dolphin. And so their voyage was a pretty uneventful fishing voyage, as all those sorts of things tend to go, until September 5th, 1723. And that's when pirate captain John Phillips enters our story. And this is an image of Phillips threatening one of his crew members. Phillips was a notorious drunk, and so that's why he's got his goblet up here and he's got his gun pointed at the crew member. And this also is another kind of contemporary image of Phillips. He was ended up becoming pretty infamous because of what I'm about to tell you. So Phillips had been a crew member, if you're familiar with Golden Age pirates at all, under Thomas Anstis and potentially Bartholomew Roberts. And so by late 1723, Anstis and Roberts were no longer, pirating. There had been a lot of death and things like that. And Phillips had ended up fleeing back to England, but he got bored after a few months. He's like, you know what, I'm not cut out for this going straight business. So he gathered up a couple other people and they go back to the Americas, and he decides, we're going to become pirates again. They steal a ship and they call it the Revenge. And so him and 4 others, including a young tailor from Ipswich, who will become important in a moment, named William White, sign the articles and become members of this crew on the Revenge. And so they decided that before they could go to their ultimate goal, the Caribbean, they needed to capture more vessels and crew members. And so in this process is where they actually end up picking up a former Blackbeard crew member named John Rose Archer, whom they quickly promote to be quartermaster on their small schooner. And then Phillips one day, again, still looking for crew members, still looking for more supplies for their voyage down to the Caribbean, because right now they're up near New England. He comes across the Dolphin on that September day, September 5th. And, well, at first it doesn't look like it's going to go all that well for the crew of the Dolphin. They're essentially threatened all with death. They're all threatened with death. And Phillips is just, like I said, he's going to kill them all. However, William White actually knew John Fillmore. They had, been apprentices at the same time, in different fields, mind you, but they had at least a passing acquaintance. And William White goes, hey, wait, I know that Fillmore guy. You should bring him on board and just leave the rest. Don't bother with it. And now, Fillmore really doesn't want to become a pirate in any way, shape, or form, at least according to his account. He doesn't think he's cut out for the pirating life. He'd rather just not. But then they're like, well, if you don't go, then we will kill literally everyone. And so the crew of the Dolphin's like, no, John, you need to go with the pirates because we're all going to die otherwise. This isn't even a choice. So Fillmore reluctantly is taken captive. He adamantly refuses to sign the pirate articles and become an official crew member. So John Phillips, and everyone's named John in this story it seems, forces him to steer the Revenge. And he says, after 2 months, I'll let you go. 2 months of doing this, you'll have served your time with me. So 2 months rolls by, and John Fillmore goes to John Phillips, again, notoriously drunk, notoriously very violent towards his crew. He's like, well, can I be let go now? It's been 2 months. And so John Phillips says, no, it's been 2 months, yes, but we haven't captured enough ships. So you're going to have to stay for another 2 months. Well, another 2 months rolls by. Well, no, still haven't captured enough ships. You got to stay. Another 2 months. And so on until after 9 months, they've gone to the Caribbean and back already. They're back up near New England after heading south. And so Fillmore and 3 others have had enough of this nonsense of being captives of pirates. They don't like it. This isn't what they wanted to do with their lives. So they conspire to mutiny. And the brains behind the operation, I guess is one way to put it, he decided that he didn't actually want to take active part in the mutiny. He was a captain of a ship that had been, the pirates had taken. So he had personal stake in this, but he decided he didn't have enough of a personal stake to actually take part. He could just help plan it. So he kind of backs out at the last minute. So Fillmore and 2 others are the ones that end up executing this plan. So they end up throwing a sailing master overboard, a guy named John Nutt. They kill the bosun, and they kill John Phillips. And so this is a very violent, quick plan that they executed, essentially where they kept a bunch of the stuff up on deck and they waited until the noon sighting. They tried to incapacitate other actual pirate crew members as much as possible by burning the soles of their feet with candles, so that way they couldn't get up the next day. They had apparently been very drunk the night before, so they wouldn't have noticed their feet being burned apparently. So, they waited until just the right moment to do this. And so, as I said, they end up, very violently taking over the ship. Well, everyone else is like, well, okay, I guess these guys are in charge now. They just, killed everyone that was supposed to be in charge. So Fillmore and the others sail the ship back into Boston because they're done being pirates. They didn't want to be on a pirate ship. They didn't want to be associated with pirates. They just wanted to go home. And so they sail the ship into Boston. They're hailed as heroes because now they've captured this big infamous pirate, John Phillips, who's been terrorizing ships off of New England and in the Caribbean for the past, almost a year at that point, talking 9 months. And so they were hailed as heroes. William White ends up being hung in Boston for piracy. John Rose Archer is also hung in Boston, and a couple of the other crew members were reportedly sent back to England where they faced trial and then were executed for piracy. And so for his role in this whole little endeavor, Fillmore is given a sword, a shoe buckle, and pistol that all had belonged to John Phillips as a reward for his 9 months as a prisoner. Well, right after this, he decides, well, I've had enough of the sea, I'm getting married, and moves to a little town, little place of the West Farms of Norwich, which is now Franklin. And he lived here, I say here, but in Franklin, until his death in 1777. So yeah, he kind of decided he had enough of the sea. And thinking back to the map again, there's not a whole lot of water access in Franklin, so it's a pretty safe place to be if you don't want to be bothered by pirates anymore. And this is actually an image of him and his wife's double gravestone in the Congregational Cemetery, which is a very wonderful cemetery. And the caretakers are very wonderful people. I do a lot of great work with them. And his is on the left and his wife's is on the right. And right here, if you notice, there's a little bit that's been chiseled out. Now, because of his little piratical adventure, people jokingly called him captain for the rest of his life. So he wasn't a part of the militia. I've never found any militia documents whatsoever. So people just called him Captain Fillmore until he passed away. And they even almost put it on his gravestone, and they did put it on his wife's. So it says, in yada, yada, yada memory, wife of Captain John Fillmore. So in stone is his little pirate adventure. And so even a small town like Franklin has connections to the golden age of piracy, which is absolutely wild. And again, helping showcase some of these deeper maritime connections, right? I mean, while there's a lot of mythology around pirates and the way that they've been portrayed in media over the past, really since the golden age of piracy, it was a real economic threat, and it is something that affected lots and lots of people around the different colonies. And even, again, in Franklin, you can see how people were affected by this. And I should also add, too, Fillmore lived in the part of town that's now Sprague, but again, he's actually buried in Franklin. So the Congregational Church's cemetery is in Franklin proper. So where his house was is no longer in Franklin, but he forever remains here. And yeah, and also, too, Fillmore's pretty important for his little mutiny because he's the reason why there's actually at least one complete set of pirate articles that had been signed by the crew members, right? So these were the rules that laid out, what the share of any loot would be, the rules that the crew were supposed to abide by, rules on fighting, things of that nature. And usually, if a pirate was going to be captured, they burned them or threw them overboard because they didn't want anyone to find out what their rules were. So because Fillmore and the others ended up killing the officers, well, there was no one to burn these documents. So by them mutinying and bringing the ship into port, they actually saved these documents, and these were reprinted in the era. And so he's the reason why there's actually a complete set of these still around, because usually it's just fragments, maybe one or two rules of that nature. So this is actually this is a really big deal, even within kind of pirate historiography. And so then the third and final part of my talk this evening is about the Navy, and also the Merchant Marine. Because Franklin also has deep connections to the Navy. So starting with the American Revolution, I'll be comparing, I shouldn't say comparing, I'll be discussing individuals from the Revolution and individuals from the First World War today, this evening. But even in the American Revolution, people from West Farms, now Franklin, were deeply involved in the sea. So the first individual I'd like to tell you about tonight is, for the Revolution, his name is Benjamin Ellis. He was a surgeon on the largest ship in the Connecticut State Navy, the Oliver Cromwell. And this is a painting from the Connecticut River Museum in Essex, Connecticut, of the Oliver Cromwell as it was built there. So Ellis was a surgeon on board. If you've ever seen Master and Commander or read the books, he's essentially the Stephen Maturin of Franklin. And so he was on board the Cromwell for when it captured 3 different ships, the Honor, the Weymouth, and the Restoration. And so here we have kind of an interesting little tidbit of maritime service and the importance of a surgeon on board a ship, especially if you're involved in fighting. There's lots of splinters that get thrown around, broken bones, gunshot wounds, things of that nature. You need a surgeon in order to make sure your crew is in tip-top shape. And Benjamin Ellis, at least for one season, served in that role. Ellis is interesting as his father was the reverend at the time of the Congregational Church, but his father actually wasn't at the Congregational Church. He was with the Continental Army. He was going around marching with them. And by 1780, the pastorate, in Franklin, in West Farms, was like, we're paying you to be our pastor, Reverend Ellis. So can you choose the army or us? And Reverend Ellis decided, I kind of like the army more. I'm going to stay with them. So we actually have writings of his from I shouldn't say we, but there's been reproductions in various places of writings of his from Valley Forge and things of that nature. He was actually pretty high up in the chaplains of the Revolution. And his son and other sons of his also were in the army, but Benjamin's the one that went to sea for a little while and was involved in some naval actions there against ships. The Oliver Cromwell, too, has quite the interesting history. In 1779, it was captured by privateers that were working for the British, who reportedly renamed it the Restoration. So again, this is a ship name that shows up a bunch, but it's quite interesting that the Oliver Cromwell was renamed the Restoration, since when Oliver Cromwell was deposed in England, that was the restoration of the monarchy. So they were playing a little bit of a back and forth with the ship names there, and then the actual history of the vessel after that is a little opaque. It was very likely then bought by the Royal Navy and brought into official British service as the Loyalist. So again, kind of play on the names there, which was then captured by the French and renamed the Loyaliste, which was then given back to the United States after the Battle of Yorktown and was renamed the USS Loyalist. So the Oliver Cromwell very likely had a very storied career during the Revolution, past its initial capture. When it was still the Oliver Cromwell. So then the next vessel and the next couple of individuals is the schooner Spy. So the Spy was originally the 50-ton Britannia from Stonington, and this was decided actually pretty early on in the Revolution to be purchased. The state of Connecticut was like, we need to have our own navy, we need a suitable ship, or a suitable vessel, I should say. And so they purchased this fairly early on. And by June 1777, it had been upgraded with 8 cannons, and it was commanded by Captain Robert Niles. And so from Franklin, the 2 people, again in the 1777 sailing season, we had Jacob Kingsbury, who was a Marine sergeant, then Jonathan Rudd, who was acting as a steward, and deserted, although the date of his desertion is unknown. And this is an image of the Spy on a stamp for the British Virgin Isles. Interesting place to find an image of the Spy. So this is an image of Jacob Kingsbury much later in his career. Jacob Kingsbury had a very long military career. He had actually been in the Continental Forces before he went to sea. He went to sea because he needed money, because he figured they were going to promote him. He had pretty good authority that he was going to be promoted by merit to an officer, but he didn't have the money to purchase a lot of the supplies he'd need as an officer. So he decided to go to sea for a little bit, make some money that way, and then join Continental Forces again. He served as an ensign through the American Revolution. He continued being in the Army in the 1780s. He was involved in the war against the Northwest Confederacy in the 1790s, which is one of the trickier parts of his legacy, just because that was a very brutal war against Indigenous Americans and kind of a precursor towards Indigenous removal of the 1830s. But he was there, and he's a connection to that from Franklin. And his headstone is about 6 foot tall. It's taller than I am. I'm about 5'10". I'll let everyone know that. And it's taller than I am, and it's the tallest gravestone in the cemetery. And the one thing it doesn't mention about his long military career is that he was on the Spy for a season. So it was very interesting to actually discover this, because usually in a case like that, you'd think his entire life story is already on there. What more could be said? As I was digging around, I found some documents from family members that said, oh yeah, I remember when I visited, my grandfather, Jacob, he told me that he had been to sea this one time. And so I was like, oh, okay, let me go look in the documents for that. And lo and behold, there he was. Before he was a colonel, as he is in this image, and before he was in charge of the defenses of this region during the War of 1812, far before then, decades, he was again on the spy. And so that season, in 1777, these are the things that he ended up doing. First, they conducted reconnaissance west of New Haven towards Long Island, and off of Long Island, they actually ended up taking 5 prisoners. And that was in late June 1777. So he was involved in taking prisoners and keeping an eye on the British. They were chased back into New London Harbor by 3 British frigates that they were supposed to be spying on in mid-July. They actually captured an empty sloop that was part of a British convoy on July 27th. They brought that back to New London. They captured the Ferguson with help of another ship named the Revenge, another kind of repeat name tonight, on August 1st. And then they captured the 80-ton, 10-gun Dolphin at anchor on September 10th. And I don't know what it is with repeat ship names this evening, but there's a lot of names we see quite frequently. So yeah, again, Jacob Kingsbury. So a lot of exciting kind of, maritime things going on there, fighting, being shot at by British frigates. According to the reports I read, they were firing broadsides at the spy. So, they're facing full firepower of those vessels. Oh, I'm just skipping ahead. And I don't know nearly as much about Jonathan Rudd, sadly. And I don't know when he'd gotten off the ship. All I know is that he was there, at least nominally. And his family was also heavily involved in the Revolution. So skipping ahead to the First World War, there continued to be a large, or at least a decent chunk, as in my opinion at least, of people from Franklin who were involved in the Navy, again showcasing this kind of deeper maritime connection. So the first individual I'll tell you about tonight is Wilton Henry Hoxie, pharmacist mate aboard the USS Bushnell for Submarine Division 5, based out of Berehaven, Ireland, from January 1918 until November 1918. This individual in particular is super exciting for me. My personal research is about Submarine Division 5 out of Berehaven, Ireland, and I never expected in my life to find someone from Franklin who was involved in that work. The Bushnell only carried so many people, and there were only so many submarines with so many crew members, so for the fact that even one of them was from this region astounded me. And so American submarines were based there. Their job was to hunt down German submarines in the Irish Sea and off the southwest corner of Ireland. They didn't succeed in attacking any of them, not for lack of trying. They encountered German submarines about 20 times. They just didn't end up sinking any. And that's an image of the Bushnell right there with an American submarine right in front of it. If I remember correctly, that's the L3. And so this is a really wonderful image that was included by Wilton Hoxie in a post-war questionnaire he filled out, the state of Connecticut. And again, going back to this idea of digital research and asking new questions and looking for new sources, as the state of Connecticut gave these questionnaires out in 1919 and 1920 towards any and all veterans from Connecticut of the First World War. And Wilton Henry Hoxie was one of the individuals who actually filled one out, and he even thought to include a picture of himself, which not many veterans ended up doing. So we were very lucky to have this. And also, there's a little bit of controversy, I should say. Some people claim he's from Lebanon. He's on the 1910 census for Franklin, as is his family. He listed his address as North Franklin on his... so North Franklin is a postal address, but he lists himself as being from Franklin, on his questionnaire. So I do consider him to be Franklin. Some people don't. It's kind of a controversial thing in the region. Also was his brother. His brother was also in the Navy. Both of them joined. His name was Alan William Hoxie. He was a boatswain's mate, second class, in the USS Canonicus, which was involved in mine laying duty up in the North Sea in 1918. So right down here, here's England, here's the English Channel. And so the Germans, they are able to come out. They have submarines based down out of Belgium. They also have submarines based out of here. And so the easiest route to attack this side, the Irish Sea and the western approaches, was not going through the English Channel. It was very heavily guarded. Was to go up and around Scotland and around that way. And that took a long time. It took decent amount of time, took a lot of fuel, but it was necessary if they didn't all want to get sunk here. So the Germans would send their submarines that way. So the Americans joined the war in 1917. There are kind of two immediate naval things that start happening. One is the U.S. starts helping with convoys of merchant ships, so all the merchant ships are kind of gathered up, and then they're guarded by destroyers and other, actually battleships even, depending on the specific route and specific location, and helping protect those from attack by German submarine. The other major contribution by the United States at sea was this mine barrage in 1918. So this idea was, well, if all the German submarines are going up this way, we place enough sea mines, well, we'll eventually sink a bunch of them and they'll just stop. The actual effect of the northern barrage is debated, but nonetheless, it was a major component of the U.S.'s war at sea in the First World War, and Alan William Hoxsey was among those conducting that work out of this vessel. So then another submarine-related individual, was a guy named Doyle Augustus Curven, who was electrician's mate, second class. He was assigned by 1919 to the submarine G2, and he actually died on July 30th, 1919, when it sank accidentally in Long Island Sound. They were towing it out they were going to test new weapon systems on it, and they accidentally left some valves and stuff open, and it sank very unexpectedly, and Doyle Curven was among the handful of people who died in that incident. And he's actually buried in Franklin. He wasn't from Franklin. And the reason he got buried in Franklin is his wife's family was from Sprague. And a lot of people in Sprague actually, at least from parts of Sprague, ended up being buried in the town cemetery. And so there's the Congregational Church Cemetery, which is one of the two main cemeteries. The other one is the town cemetery known as Pottapog Cemetery. And he's buried in Pottapog. It's a little closer to Sprague. But he is buried there, and it's another connection to the United States Submarine Service that I did not know we had. And again, looking back to all of these kinds of various duties, you would never have expected someone from Franklin to have participated in. And then there's Frank Jesse Davis, an engineer first class on the USS Nopatan. He was involved in transporting troops back to the United States after the armistice. So he started that in about January of 1919. And this is just an image of his ship. Very important. It's one thing to get all the troops there, but you also have to bring them back eventually. So he was involved in that. There was Leroy Perkins Simpson, electrician second class in radio, on board the USS New York, which is the ship on the left there. That's a British dreadnought on the right. And so he was, a radio man. And the New York was involved in convoy duties, actually, up this way. Alongside the Royal Navy. So they would actually convoy merchant vessels to and from port. And so he was involved in that duty as well. So we have people from Franklin who are involved in kind of the three main, really every major way that the United States was involved in the war at sea in World War I. And in addition to these members of the Navy, there were also merchant mariners in this period, in both of these periods. So for the Revolution, rewinding a bit, there's James Hyde, captain, who was potentially a merchant sailor. Haven't found a whole lot of documents, but we know he was a sailor of some kind, as he died at sea in 1785, a couple of years after the Revolution. And this on the right is just a excerpt from his estate. So when they started just tallying up what he had owned once news had gotten back to Franklin. And then for the First World War era is John Christopher Russ, who was a merchant mariner. He was born in 1895 in Norwich, and he worked as a merchant mariner for about 20 years, from the mid-1910s until the 1930s. And this on the right is one of his applications for protection papers. And he worked for a time, at least, with United Fruit Company, and this is one of the ships he was on. And so in each of these time periods, in each of these kind of major categories, I hope I've kind of elucidated ways that even a small town has connections to the sea, where people will make their careers at sea, where they will go and get money either for a season or for decades, where people will participate in national defense, and just be really, really connected to the world around them. Franklin's not just this small little farming town, right? That's not changing. And growing up, I would have fooled me. But as it turns out, through research like this, It's really not. These people went out and saw the world in so many different ways and interacted with the world around them. And it's not to say that the only way to do that is through the sea. However, if you're on a whale ship and you're going to the Arctic Ocean, you're going to the Pacific, you're visiting places like Hawaii and further afield, you're interacting in the world in a very different way than someone who stays in this region is. And so all of these, in my eyes, have been really wonderful examples of the way that Franklin is not just that small little idyllic rural farming town that I grew up believing it was. Rather, it's a much more dynamic, dynamic and ever-changing place. And it's just as much of a part of, the wider society as anywhere else is. It changes with the times, and the times change it, and it changes the times. It's been affected by social and cultural changes, and it's part of that much larger world. And so writing, a new narrative of town history is only possible by continuing to ask new questions and to search for previously unused sources and even asking old sources new questions. Like asking simply, what isn't on this source? What am I not being told by what I'm looking at? And then going and finding something that will tell you what you're missing. So that's Franklin and the Sea in a nutshell. I hope you all enjoyed this talk. Thank you for being here. If you have any questions, please.
Where did the name Franklin come from?
Benjamin Franklin, actually. Yep, we actually do have record of that. When they were deciding what to name the town in 1785, it was voted on to be named after Benjamin Franklin. Yep.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Yes.
So was John Fillmore Millard Fillmore's grandfather?
Yes, his great-grandfather. Yep.
Okay, because Millard Fillmore attended when when Norwich had its 200th birthday in 1859. Millard Fillmore was one of the guests of honor. He had already been president. He was a former president.
Yep.
I knew there was a connection, but I didn't know what it was.
Yep, that's the connection. Yep, it was his great-grandfather. Yes.
You mentioned protection papers.
Yes.
What are those?
Yes, so protection papers, essentially, they're a document from the U.S. government that says, yes, this sailor is in fact a citizen of the U.S. It was really born out, especially of the late 1700s into the early 1800s, where sailors could get impressed into naval service. And this was to show that, no, you can't do that because I'm actually an American citizen. I'm not an escaped British sailor or something like that. It was a way of proving who you were. And so this practice has continued up until today. Yep.
Barnum's Rocks.
Yes.
Is there any idea why he built them?
Honestly, still don't have an actual clue of why he built them, beyond the fact that I don't think he wanted any more stone walls. Like I said, I've never seen anything written from him or his wife about their purpose. His wife's obituary did mention that he kind of wanted to have been buried under them, from what we understand, and this is where there's actually a little bit of mystery still that we're still researching. Him and his wife are supposedly buried in the Yantic Cemetery in Norwich. We've been to the Yantic Cemetery. We've gone to where they should be. There's no gravestones. It doesn't look like there's any graves there. We've asked the people who maintain that cemetery. They've walked it too. They have no idea. So they actually might be buried under there. That's not saying it's actually where they're buried. It's a possibility. So he might have built them as these monuments, but we don't know for sure. We would need like ground penetrating radar and check more resources and stuff like that. Good question. Yes.
In a photograph of the double headstone, looks like a white plastic tube over on the left.
Oh, yes.
Now, in our Lower Mystic Cemetery, there are a bunch of those around because I use them to put the flags for the veterans. Is that what that was for?
Yes, this one was, but again, this picture was taken a number of years ago. This isn't a recent photograph. And through research I've done and more research that church members and people who've been taking care of the cemetery have been doing, some of the graves that used to have flags have been moved. They've been like, oh, okay, this person wasn't actually a veteran in a case like this, being one of them. So yes, this photograph was from when he was thought to have been a militia captain.
Yeah.
Yep.
Anyone else? One last thing, Matt.
Thank
you very
much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.